So here's the full list that we'll be going over the course of the semester. You'll see this list over and over and over again. You'll probably get sick of it. But for the next 2 weeks, we'll be talking about melody, dynamics, rhythm, harmony, texture, timbre, not timbre, but timbre, form, and word-music relationships. So number 8 only applies to music that has lyrics or words to it if you're singing along, but the other 7 we'll see in any piece of music. So today I would like to cover the first 3. Oops. So number 1, melody. Move myself over. Melody is defined as a succession of single pitches heard as a recognizable whole. So in other words, this is the tune of any piece of music. If you get a song stuck in your head and you find yourself humming or whistling along to it for the rest of the day, that's the melody. So we're talking about one pitch after another, after another, after another. So it's sort of a horizontal element here. And there are several different ways that we can talk about a melody, that we can describe a melody. Of course, we can always say a melody sounds beautiful, or it sounds haunting, or sad, or ugly, but there are actually particular musical vocabulary words that we can use to explain exactly why something sounds sad or why something sounds heartbreakingly beautiful. So we'll use contour, range, and interval size to do that. Get myself out of the way again. So the first 2 melodic qualities here that we can define, contour and range. Now, you're probably familiar with the word contour. It can be used in lots of different contexts. For example, you can contour your makeup and create shapes and an illumination of different parts of your face. If you're good at makeup, I'm not. You can talk about the contour of somebody's body, the contour of a landscape, or the shape of a city's skyline, but it's the overall shape of a melody. Is it ascending upwards? Is it descending downwards? Is it wavy? Is it jagged? That would be describing the contour. So you can often figure out the contour of a melody by almost playing a game of connect the dots between the note heads. As you can see, I've done right here with this highlighter. If you just trace your cursor, your finger, your pen along each of the notes, you'll get the contour. So here I would describe this particular melody as maybe being sort of an arc shape. It starts downwards, moves upward, and then ends back downward again on the same pitch. We can also talk about range when describing a melody, and as it's used in math, you know, the difference between the highest number and the lowest number, we can do the same thing with pitches. So in this case, without even being able to read music, you can see that the highest note on all 5 of these lines would be these ones right here. That's an A. And the lowest note, the one that's furthest down on the staff, would be these ones down here. You can also find it down here. That's a C. So that's a relatively small range. There's only a couple of pitches in between each one of those. And range will determine how difficult a melody is to sing or to perform. Generally, children's melodies, folk melodies, a lot of pop melodies tend to have a relatively smooth contour and a relatively small range because it's much easier to sing and to memorize a melody in that case. So if you read music, you might already recognize the melody right here. If not, I will play it for you right now. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. All right. Continuing our discussion of, I'm trying to hide myself over here. Continuing our discussion of melody, we can also describe the distance between the individual pitches, and we'll refer to those as intervals. So melodies can be conjunct or disjunct, or they can be a combination of the two to make it confusing. Melodies that move by small intervals, meaning there aren't big spaces between the notes, are referred to as conjunct. So if we're talking about a scale as going A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A and B are conjunct. They are right next to each other as they are in the alphabet, whereas A and F are far away from one another in both the alphabet and the scale, so that would be a disjunct interval. So I'll play you an example here. Here's an A and a B right next to each other. It sounds relatively smooth. Or if you play a scale one after the other, that would be a conjunct melody. Disjunct would be two pitches that are far away from one another. So here's an example of a disjunct interval. It's a little bit jarring, it's a little bit angular. So those two pitches are quite far away from one another. One is very low, one is very high. So each one of them will lend different qualities to a melody. I would characterize the Twinkle Twinkle Little Star that we have right here as being conjunct because most of the notes are following one right after another. There is a larger space between these notes in the first measure, but otherwise it's relatively simple as you'd expect for a children's song. All right, next I want to play a couple examples of melodies for you. And then we can kind of pick them apart and figure out how exactly we would describe these melodies in terms of the qualities we just defined. So this first one is Ode to Joy from Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the last movement. It's a very famous melody. Probably sounds familiar to you. So think for a minute how you would describe this. Is it conjunct? Is it disjunct? What is the contour like? Again, if you trace your finger, cursor, whatever, along each one of the note heads, you can kind of get a sense of the contour. And as I do that here, I'm seeing that the contour appears to be moving upwards and downwards in a very gentle slope. So I would describe this melody as being wavy, perhaps. You're free to be creative about how you describe these here, but both of these lines seem to work that same way. In terms of the intervallic distances here, I would also say that this is a conjunct melody because it moves upwards or downwards by only one step. So you can see we move here at the beginning, line, space, line, down a space, down a line, down a space, down a line. There's actually no gaps between the notes. Each one moves by an entire step. So it's a relatively smooth, gentle flowing melody. Next example here, this is Joy to the World, something that I'm sure is familiar once again. So I'll play you this real quick. All right, so how would we describe this one? If we look at the range here, that makes it pretty obvious. The highest note up on the staff is the very first note, and you can follow the contour downwards, trace it along, and you'll see that the lowest note is the last note actually. So again, this is a conjunct melody. There's no big giant leaps. And we can also describe the contour as moving downwards or descending. It moves straight down. And if you actually take away the rhythm that's been notated here, you might notice that it really is just a descending scale. So again, pretty simple, pretty easy to sing along with. All right, finally let's look at the Star-Spangled Banner. This one is notoriously difficult to sing, and when we describe the melodic qualities, it becomes obvious why. So I'll play this here, although we all know how it actually goes. All right, so what makes this one different? What makes it a little bit more difficult to sing along with? First of all, it is quite disjunct. So rather than following space, line, space, we see distances between notes that are much larger, especially between U and C, and by, they jump up quite a bit, which is always harder to sing along with, harder to play. So this is a disjunct melody. If we want to talk about the contour, we move downwards, upwards, downwards, upwards. So following a similar kind of wavy pattern as we saw with Beethoven. So that's a quick example about how we can describe melodies in terms of contour, range, and intervals. But one other important aspect when we talk about music, I'll hide myself again, is the use of phrasing. So music, we often talk about music as being a language or a way to communicate with one another. In much the same way, music acts a lot like language in terms of phrasing and cadence. So when we're speaking, we have pauses, we have stops, we use commas and periods, and you know when somebody has reached the end of what they're trying to say, and when they begin again, and you have to stop and take breaths throughout, etc., etc. And the same thing can be used to describe melodies. So here's another well-known melody, Amazing Grace, and I've marked in vertical red lines where the phrases end. So we sing a phrase, you pause, take a breath, and continue on with the second phrase, pause, take a breath, and you finally know when it ends once we get to the cadence. So I'll play through this and hide myself here and play through this to kind of give you a sense of how phrasing works. Imagine that you were singing along with this. When would you stop and take a breath? Breathe. 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 And we're done. So the final ending right there is called the cadence, and we all sort of know intuitively that that's where the piece ends. If I were to stop abruptly in the middle of one of the phrases, it wouldn't feel quite as final as it did at the cadence. For example, you should feel a little bit uncomfortable, right? Your ears hear what should come next, and you feel this uncomfortable sense that you need to hear the rest of it. So I'm sorry to leave you off right there. And if you have ever been in the car and you're listening to the radio and you park, you need to get out of the car, but you're partway through a song and you ever sit there and think, I need to wait until they finish this part of the song until it feels like it's done. That's your brain intuitively looking for a cadence. So it's something that happens naturally whether or not you know what's going on or know anything about music. Okay, so that concludes our discussion about melody. So now let's turn to dynamics. Let me try to hide myself again here. So